Hi, my name is Ashraf Ram, and I'm joined by Abdullah Koker, and we are the co-hosts of the podcast The Second Curve. And this podcast focuses on the second curve of learning that people often go through in their career, along with stories and experiences that shaped who they are today. Our goal is to take these stories and share them, along with uncovering what the next big thing will be in their industry.
So today we're here with Brian Howell. How are you doing, Brian?
Doing great. How are you guys?
I'm doing great. Yeah, just getting right into it for the viewers who aren't sure of what you do. Could you give a quick explanation of maybe your current role and your current industry that you work in?
Yeah, so my entire career has been in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. So, kind of the life sciences segment, I guess you can call it. My career has taken a couple of phases, and I'm sure we'll get into that over the next many minutes. But I have spent a lot of time in some of the commercial functions, but mostly in supply chain and procurement as it relates to life science products and research and development for drugs. And that's kind of where I have sat in that kind of niche in the industry for the last almost 30 years is how things are purchased and sold into life science organizations to discover and develop drugs. That's kind of where I sit.
Nice. Very interesting. And I think of last week when we were talking to you, before we were actually gonna record today, you were mentioning how you were very interested in chemistry early on. So you want to explain like essentially what originally pulled you into chemistry and like the biopharma space?
Yeah, I mean it's a funny story. I mean, I took chemistry in high school. I think you guys are in the same place right now that I was. And we had a great program in my high school, great teacher, loved the subject, and it made me want to go and major in chemistry. I mean, she basically encouraged us to do it and challenged us to do that. And so a number of us did. We went into college and majored in chemistry, and it was a subject that she inspired a love of for me and still do. I'm not a particularly strong chemist. In fact, I've rarely actually worked as a chemist because I also realized pretty early on in my chemistry training in college that I didn't want to be a chemist. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't anything. It was too solitary. It was too lonely, really, and I just didn't want to do it as a profession. But I wanted to finish, and so it generated ideas in my head in terms of what I wanted to do. I didn't want to get rid of it, but I didn't want to be a chemist. So that's kind of where I started.
Yeah, going off of mentioning that it's kind of lonely sometimes being like a chemist or going down that path. Would you say that you enjoy working with people? Like especially like kind of in like a more communication kind of thing, working in teams.
Yeah, I mean, look, we can talk about this at length. Working with people, working with teams, collaborating, communicating is in many ways the kind of the commonality of being successful in any number of industries or functions or jobs. If you can't work with people, if you can't communicate your thoughts and ideas effectively, if you can't take some complex thoughts and ideas and turn them into something that's easily communicatable, then you're never going to succeed. For me, I didn't want to be a chemist, but I knew I wanted to be in the industry. And so I ended up going to grad school pretty much after I finished my chemistry degree. And for lack of any deep thought, I kind of said, well, what am I going to do that's not chemistry, but I still want to be in the industry? So I kind of placed myself what I now call the business of science. And so to do that, I got a degree. I got an MBA in marketing and in supply chain management, or as they called it back in the day, operations management. Because without any specific guidance, I just thought that was a good place to tack on to a technical degree. Because chemistry, at least, I knew that they were going to have to manage the operations and the manufacturing and all that, and maybe marketing and sales as well. And so that was just frankly dumb luck, because both of those things have become effectively the two curves, if you will, of my career.
Yeah, and you mentioned like that you didn't want to be a chemist like right after college. What like told you like what experience told you like no, I'm not gonna be a chemist. I want to do something else and like
Yeah, well, it's very, very easy to pinpoint this. I was doing research topics as an undergraduate. I was in a lab. Academic labs are not necessarily known for their high levels of oversight and safety protocols. And I was doing some experiments and something kind of basically flashed in my face. Now, that wasn't the school's fault. It wasn't anything's fault. It's just like, okay, this is an experience that tells me I am not suited for this sort of work. I'm not detail oriented enough. And it was like, okay, I'm done. So that's all fine and good, but I'm clearly not cut out to be working on the bench in chemistry. And that was kind of a funny kind of decision point. It's like, yeah, this is definitely not my calling. I still love it, but it's just not my thing. That's kind of a very easy thing to point to. I think I was a junior in college at the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then just moving on to your role in you meant like the manufacturing and operations side of things. If you could give us like a quick overview of kind of where that started and where I know right now you're doing a lot of independent consulting as well, but where that kind of has led you from kind of the business of science.
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of the timeline starting out from when I graduated with my MBA. I was lucky enough to get into a training program that would move me around this giant chemical company, a German company called BASF. And they said, okay, well, we'll put you in 3 or 4 different 6-month rotations, and they can be in chemistry, they can be in marketing, they could be in whatever. And the first 2 that I did were at a manufacturing facility in Texas. And the first one was quality assurance chemistry. So I actually was doing chemistry. And then the second one I did was in a plant, in a manufacturing plant, doing production chemistry. So we were taking samples along the production process and taking samples to make sure that the material was being manufactured according to spec. So I did that, and that was just pure, industrial chemicals. I had not hit the pharmaceutical side of my career yet. And it was interesting, but it was not what I wanted to do. So I asked to move in the next round to a marketing role. And so they moved me up to their headquarters in New Jersey. And I did some marketing and product management for other large industrial chemicals. And that whole thing was very much organized around large scale, high volume, integrated manufacturing, all the way back from oil cracked down to various components and turned into various sorts of hydrocarbons of one shape or another. The product that I was manufacturing was a resin called polycaprolactam, which is actually polymerized into material that goes into things like diapers. It's a highly absorbent chemical. So it was kind of an interesting thing, but again, it wasn't really what I was hoping to do with my life. And I was still in training, but I got the opportunity in my last training round to go into a business that manufactured and sold pharmaceutical chemicals. And that was new and that was neat. And I didn't even know it existed. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I kind of ended up there without a lot of guidance. It was just luck. And I loved it, working in the pharmaceutical industry. And that was around manufacturing materials that were going into drugs, or whether it's the active ingredient, the thing that actually has the pharmacological property, or it's other chemicals that were put in together to make it bind, or whether it made it, excrete at a certain rate. Those are the sorts of chemicals that we were making. And so I was in a position to see the manufacturing side of the business, but I was also kind of thrust into the front end customer side. So it was a little bit of both. It was such a small business that it gave me the opportunity to see both sides. And it did give me a grounding in the manufacturing side, but it was really the first element of being exposed to the supply chain too, because most of that stuff was manufactured in Europe and I was based here in the US at the time. And it was my responsibility to bring that material in the right quantities, distribute it out to the customers, keep us in stock, don't keep too much, keep enough to not disappoint customers. And so it was really that bridge, that first role between manufacturing, supply chain, and customer interactions. So it was a great first role for me, for sure.
Yeah, and so like talking about your first role, how did like what you're working on now, like how did that change from your first role, and like how did your focus change as the industry shifts? So like what was your like kind of first and second career?
So I would say that those first, 3 or 4 roles in that company were very much formative. They were training. I wasn't a super senior person. I was just learning how the business ran and what was happening. And I'm sure a lot of the folks you talk to have these transition points, these times when things happen in a particularly, way. And I had been in this company for 6, 7 years and I was having a good time, but I was looking for something. And I get a call out of the blue. And I think this is a theme that happened to me over and over again, where people they see you for what you're doing, they see potential, and they take a risk on you. And this guy was one of my customers. He was the head of procurement and supply chain for one of my pharmaceutical customers. And they said, hey, we have an opening in procurement, and we think you'd be great for it. And I didn't know anything about anything in this role, but I took it because there's a couple of things that I've always subscribed to from a philosophy perspective. Is one, always say yes to an opportunity like that. Never say no. If you don't know how to do it, it doesn't matter. Say yes and then figure it out later. There's a saying that says, "Jump and the net will appear," and that's exactly my philosophy. So I took this job and going, okay, well, I don't even know what this is, but it sounds interesting, and it kind of fit my philosophy also of staying in the pharmaceutical industry, but seeing it from a number of different perspectives. Because I'd seen it from the chemical manufacturing side, which is way upstream, but this gave me the opportunity to see how the drugs themselves, the finished dosages, were actually handled, how they were marketed, how they were sold to the actual physicians and the patients. And so that was really exciting. And so I took the job, and it was completely different. It's probably the most intense 2-year training of any job I've ever had. It was just incredibly fast paced, learned a ton, and I ended up really liking procurement. So my first curve, if you will, was like, wow, this whole procurement thing is kind of cool because it gives you a perspective on the entire enterprise. Whereas a lot of things are just very focused on what you're doing as a part of a bigger picture. Procurement tends to look at the entire company and give, and create benefit for the company, not just for one person. You tend to have a very strategic point of view there. So I really liked that. But for reasons, I wanted to move on, and I ended up at Johnson and Johnson. And again, a totally different area, which is what I tend to look for. This area was in clinical development, which is basically testing potential drugs on people. It's basically what a clinical trial is. And so I was involved early on with writing contracts and doing basic contracting between Johnson and Johnson and some of the providers we were doing and some of the sites and physicians. It was dull, honestly. It was not what I wanted to do, but it was a great learning experience. And of course, as things tend to do, something happens, it gives you a weird opportunity out of left field. And again, there was this job that came up, and I just joined the company less than a year. And so I felt a little bit obligated to stay in the role that I was in, but this other thing popped open that was just so perfect for my interests and my background. And it was just a passion. And it was an opportunity to help the entire company select and manage a very small number of extremely strategic third-party providers. And in this case, they were clinical research organizations or CROs, these companies that do these clinical trials on behalf of these big pharmaceutical companies. And they were using a bunch of companies, but it was kind of all over the place. And so this program got put in place to put some structure around that and to manage those supplier relationships in a more strategic way. That sounded fun to me. And so I lobbied hard to the person that was running the business. It's like, I really want this job. And it's probably one of the few times I really was annoying to a hiring manager. It's like, this is what I want to do. And she gave me an opportunity. And I did that job for off and on for about 4 years. I ended up taking her job when she left. And it was just such an interesting thing. It gave you a really clear point of view. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is driven by innovation. It's driven by intellectual property. A company will go and they'll spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find that next drug. And then they spend another hundreds of millions to bring it to the market. And then they spend more hundreds of millions to market it. But without that engine, without that discovery and development engine, those companies are nowhere. And so looking at the clinical pipeline, those numbers of products that are being developed and tested in populations of patients was such an interesting inside view of the future of this company. And I just really thoroughly enjoyed dealing with it. And plus, I was thrust into some pretty senior company. As a fairly young person, I was in my probably early mid 30s. So I was dealing with very senior executives within the company, but also, senior executives up to the CEOs of these large companies that we're working with. And so it was a lot of responsibility that I thought brought a lot of value to the enterprise. It was a really, really fun job.
Yeah, it's that's really interesting to hear about. Meeting with such like senior people. Being pretty early in your career as well, like, and having these kind of recurring, not necessarily recurring, but like one-off opportunities that show up. And I like that mentality of jumping first and having the net come later and like figuring it out later. And you mentioned stuff about companies throwing millions and hundreds of millions of dollars just for like a chance for something to work out to find the next drug. And I just wanted to bounce off of that a little bit and ask, where do you think a lot of that is going, in the sense that with recent developments in like technology with AI and other trends that have been more recent, Do you think that's going to change in some significant way, or is the same strategy going to be employed?
It's a great question. And it's funny because I've come in and out of that part of the drug development process over the last 10, 15 years. And every time I leave, I come back and I think, wow, I'm sure this is dramatically different. And there's so much technology that can be brought to bear. And it is to a degree. So the answer is kind of on both sides. One is there's tons of ways that technology can be brought to make this process much more efficient. It is a deeply, deeply inefficient process to take a compound and test it amongst hundreds or maybe sometimes thousands of patients to prove to the FDA or other regulatory authorities that this drug is safe enough and effective enough to put on the market. So it's just a big endeavor. There are tons of things to do. I mean, back 10, 15 years ago, just the use of an iPad was groundbreaking in some of the processes that were being employed to do this process. And that seemed to be a great thing. Now, of course, we're talking about AI. We're talking about using various bots or various models to go through site, like clinical site processes to pay different people on time, to look through contract language in a much more efficient way. So there's a ton of ways that they're using technology to make things better. The problem is fundamentally is that this is a very risk-based business. And when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, companies are super risk averse. And frankly, they should be, because they don't want to put a drug on the market that's going to ultimately hurt people or kill people. And it's happened in the past. And FDA and others are also very supportive of those sorts of rigor and process because they don't want to approve a drug that ultimately ends up being destructive too. So there's a high level of risk. There's a low level of risk tolerance in this industry. So yes, you can do a lot of things a lot better, more efficiently with tech and other things, but to a certain degree, you're never going to overcome the industry's bias towards risk aversion. And that's probably healthy because you're dealing with people's lives and you don't want to do harm, right? So it's a tension that is constantly in place.
Yeah. And you mentioned like risk averse and like the biopharma industry being like the most like potential for risk. Do you think that's the most out of like every industry? Like we've talked to people from like different industries. Do you think like the biotech industry allows for the most risk, or what are your thoughts?
Well, it's I would say it's one of the most highly regulated industries for sure. You know, all the things you have to do to discover a drug, to prove it's efficient, effective, and safe to a patient population, to manufacture it to such a specification to ensure that every single dose you make is going to have the same exact impact. The level of regulation around that is daunting, and that it's expensive, right? Is it the most regulated? It's up there. I mean, financial services is also extremely highly regulated for good reason, probably not enough. And then there's others as well. But having worked in biopharma for most of my career, it is an extraordinarily highly controlled environment. And in my opinion, for good reason.
Right. And in kind of parallel with how regulated it may be, you've been working in biopharma for like basically like your whole life, right? I wanted to get your opinion on how do you think, young professionals should approach or consider the field if they're interested, or maybe they don't know too much about the field, and like, are there other types of roles that are maybe more, analytical or tech based, or on the business side of things? I just wanted to get some insight into that.
I mean, I think the good news here for anybody wanting to go into the industry is that demographics are working to your favor. The drug industry exists to treat certain populations. The older the population is, the sicker they generally are. That's not a surprise. And based on demographics, with the baby boom generation starting to age out, the number of the size of the patient population is constantly growing. So the market for the pharmaceutical industry is growing. There's a lot of things that mitigate that with insurance and payments and all kinds of other things, pricing pressure, all that typical business stuff. But as a fundamental macro trend, drug development and drug marketing is going to be there for a very long time. So it's a great place to be. Unlike certain things that could, maybe you want to be in real estate or something, you want to sell real estate. Well, I don't know about that from a technology perspective. There's a lot of things that are going to change how that's going to be done over the course of time. Or maybe you want to go into retail. There's a lot of risk associated with some of these industries, whereas I think pharma is going to be there for a long time. So that's, on a baseline perspective, is a great place to start. In terms of where a young person would want to go into the industry, I think it's like anything else. What do you enjoy doing? There's operations, there's manufacturing, there's tech, the opportunity for tech graduates in the biopharma space is really cool. I mean, if you're going into things like data science, the sorts of technologies that are associated with, they call it in silico drug development. They actually find out how a molecule will behave on a computer without having to actually test it or even create the molecule itself. So, and there's a number of ways I can't even describe to you how that works. It's really very high tech. But if you're a tech person, if you're manufacturing interested, if you're interested in sales and marketing, supply chain, HR, any of those things, there are great avenues to be working into the industry. And like any other industry, the best thing you can do is to talk your way in. Meet people that you know, get references, find out people that work in the industry, and talk to those people like you're doing with me today. And that's the best way to get in. And there's any number of ways to do that for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, just going off of that, I mean, you talked a lot about throughout your career, there's been these times where opportunities come up, and people will like kind of take chances on you, right? And you're also taking a chance, right? Oftentimes pivoting and trying out something new. And just like we're talking today, do you have any advice for anyone who's maybe new in their field? Maybe they've been established, but getting people to take chances on you. Are there any specific character traits you would say, like maybe from your perspective, is there something that you would be looking for in a person where it's like, I can take a chance on this person, they'll figure something out?
The thing that I don't really care about is what you studied and what you know. I don't care about that. I wouldn't expect anybody in their early 20s or mid 20s to be some sort of subject matter expert. What I want to find is somebody who's eager and is willing to learn and will always say yes and will be available and give their all out effort on something. And failure happens. So I don't really care about that. I mean, I don't want you to fail over and over, but that's not probably going to happen. I think if you bring your A game all the time and always say yes, and it's my mantra, always say yes, figure it out, talk to a bunch of people and figure out what the best way forward is. You have good communication skills. That's where it's at. It's not about studying the right thing or having everything perfectly lined up on your resume. You don't have to have cured cancer to get into college. I mean, but I think you have to, it's behaviors, and it's funny, they used to call those soft skills. And if you look at some of the leadership studies now, some of the latest thinking about leadership and about effectiveness, those so-called soft skills are actually not soft at all. Those are the skills that define how people are successful. And you can develop those early on just by being eager, available, willing, versatile, open-minded, and communicative. Those are the sorts of things people will gravitate to. It's like, oh yeah, you have a degree from so-and-so and whatever. That's great too, but I really like this person and I want to give them a chance. So I think most people, certainly for young folks, will give you a chance if you just exude the sorts of openness and behaviors that I described.
Yeah, and you mentioned like soft skills being very important. I was reading like an article yesterday. It was like in The Economist. It was on like leadership and how that like employs soft skills. But do you think there's like some characteristics or skills that are just like pertinent to like biopharma industry, like that you should have in the biopharma industry compared to others, or do you think like the skills like soft skills and things like that you need in every industry, it should just be like that, or is there like some specific skills that you want to?
I think they translate. I don't think it's industry specific. I think the things that'll make you successful in biopharma will make you successful anywhere. I mean, obviously, if you want to stay in the industry, having a scientific background tends to be helpful, but it doesn't define. I could have done what I did without a chemistry degree. It helped me. It gave me a vocabulary and it gave me a comfort factor with some of the more technical elements of what I was facing, but it wasn't required. What got me where I was is some of those attitudes, some of the learning, some of the approach to how I've approached my career, the choices that I made, and a lot of people helped me along the way. But I think that's universal. I don't think that's biopharma specific.
Yeah, and going back, if you could choose to kind of do college over again, be in that position again, would you choose to do chemistry again, or would you major in something else?
That's a good question. I've always kind of thought through would I have done anything different, and I guess the answer generally is no. I mean, I'm happy with the decisions I've made. I think the one thing I would say that I wish I'd had more availability to or visibility to generally are certain functional areas that I just didn't learn until much too late. I think it would be valuable for me personally to have better understood finance, and I studied it a little bit in grad school, but I wasn't a fan. But understanding how finance and accounting works with the things that I was doing is only a skill that I picked up in the last 5 or 6 years. And that was a mistake. That the notion of how capital is allocated in any industry is really helpful. And I was working with private equity for a while, and they do it better than probably anybody. The notion of what private equity does and venture capital does for any industry is something that I did not get exposed to early, and I wish I had. Not to say that I would have gone into private equity or venture capital early on. I'm not sure I have the right background for it, but just some exposure to certain things like that earlier would have been good for me. But it's not that I regret the decisions I made. I think my educational background was set me up perfectly. And I was extremely fortunate with the companies that recruited me, the companies I went to, the jobs I took, and the managers, most of them that I worked with. And it gave me a lot of background and a lot of foundation for some really interesting work throughout my career.
Yeah, I mean, like that's great to hear. It's very nice that you had like you're like kind of fulfilled with what you did, even though like with all the changes now, like in with like AI and all that affecting the biopharma industry. But I think it's been like today been a great time speaking with you because we haven't interviewed someone that was in the biopharma industry yet. So it's like a new perspective for us because the biopharma industry is like new and rising. So Abdullah, do you have any other like final thoughts?
Any final thoughts? I mean, first of all, we'd love to have you on again. We had a great conversation today, and I'd love to extend it some other time as well. We can talk about, we could take maybe specifics. We could deep dive into specific trends that are going on or things that are maybe like in the news. Maybe just one final question would be, if you have somebody who's early in their career, coming out of high school, coming out of college, if you give them like one solid piece of advice to kind of shape or put them in a direction, what would it be?
It's a good question. And it might be subject for the next chat. Is I took this supply chain and procurement curve and turned it into one in sales. And that was my second curve, if you will. And I spent the last 6 years in sales and account management. I think everybody would benefit from doing some portion of their career in sales because no matter what you're doing, whether you're in finance, tech, HR, marketing, manufacturing, supply chain, you're in sales. If you're working in a big company, you are always in the process of trying to sell yourself, trying to sell your work product, trying to sell your ideas, and going through some formal sales training early in your career. That's one regret. I can tell you that. I wish I had done it earlier. And I was in a kind of a low grade, untrained sales mode early, but I was given no training. And I think that formal sales training process and pharmaceuticals is well known for great sales training. They typically don't take you right out of school. You usually have to go sell anything else for a couple of years, and then they'll take you and train you. If you have a medical or scientific mind, it helps. But I think people underestimate the reliance that they will have on being able to communicate and sell ideas. And so having a background in sales, even though it's not, people don't think, oh, I don't need to be in sales. Everybody's selling. Everybody is selling. And so
Yeah,
it's an important skill.
yeah. I mean, I hear a lot about college admissions, job interviews as like being parallel to a sales pitch, right? Even like, there was a couple kids from our school graduated a couple years before they got into Y Combinator for a startup, right? That's literally a sales pitch. You don't, objectively, you might have the best idea on paper, but if you can't communicate it to the other person, just like a job interview, just like a college application, I think it's a great piece of advice. You could be the best on paper, the best qualifications, but if you can't sell yourself, or you could have the best product, but if you can't sell it, then it doesn't have the same value.
Well, I also, one of my other kind of philosophies is there's always going to be somebody out there that's better than you. It's impossible. It's rare that you are the best in the world at something. So if you're going for a job, you have to assume that there's other people out there that are as good, if not better than you. And you have to figure out how to differentiate yourself and how to stand out, right? So, if you're going into college and applying to MIT, what do they have? 6% acceptance rate? Something like that, 7%. And I would suspect that it's okay, let's less. So those 95 kids that get rejected, I suspect that every one of those kids would be very successful at MIT, but they didn't get in. So why not? So it's daunting to say that, but life and work, generally speaking, is a competition. And you have to be able to articulate why you're better or why you are better positioned than the other people to do something, be accepted into something. So it's kind of harsh, but it's fact.
Yeah. And like the philosophy of like getting your point across, even if you're like the best on paper, is like great philosophy. Like it's definitely like very good advice to give to
I
anyone.
mean, something that a lot of senior leaders do really well is to take complexity, because the world is complex, ideas are complex, companies are complex, and taking that complexity and communicating it simply and compellingly. And if you can do that on paper and personally, then that's a skill set that frankly not enough people have. But some of my most compelling leaders can literally stand in front of an audience of 2,000 people and have them just standing ovation after 30 minutes of just simply talking from their heart. It's remarkable the power of great communication and great
Yeah,
salesmanship.
that immediately reminds me of Two people. It reminds me of Richard Feynman, the physicist, and it reminds me of Benjamin Graham, the founder of Y Combinator. And both of them, one's a physicist, one's making a startup incubator, and they're both highly regarded in their field for one main reason, which is that they can take crazy complex ideas and give it to you in simple language, right? When you have those like great speakers and as we're saying, like great leaders, they're not going up to the stage and spitting a bunch of jargon at you to try and impress you or, any of that. They can communicate amazing ideas in simple English language, but somehow do it so eloquently that you're moved, right? They almost, not only in speaking, but sometimes in writing, if you've ever read Benjamin Graham's essays, he writes the way people speak, but it kind of strips away a lot of that vocabulary and jargon, and it gets right to the heart of what the idea is. It makes the speaker and the audience address the substance of what the person is saying, and I think that can speak a lot to how you can approach things, not only in like a corporate or like a public speaking setting, but even like when you're trying to sell yourself, right?
Great. Totally agree. Yeah, it's pretty powerful when you hear somebody talk like that. It's like, wow, I wish I could do that, but it's pretty impressive.
It's crazy. Like when you, I mean, like when you're seeing someone talk that well, it's just like, it's just you can't like really say anything. Like honestly, like if I see someone talk that well, I'm just like amazed.
Yeah, it's a little intimidating, but it also is really thrilling. Now,
Absolutely.
there was a guy that ran the research organization at a big pharmaceutical company in Cambridge. You know, he was so smart. I mean, it was ridiculous. He went and got a master's degree in biochemistry from Harvard because he was curious. That kind of crazy smart. But yet he would talk to you in a way that it was like a cheerleader, and it was so compelling. You would have done anything for the guy. I mean, literally anything. And that sort of motivation in a leadership role is really, really important. Not to just say, well, this is what we're going to achieve for the year and talk about results and talk about goals and objectives. It's important, but it's not going to get anybody excited. You know, you have to
Right.
be able to appeal to people, because people don't get up in the morning every day to go to work to meet corporate objectives.
Yeah.
They go to work because of the way they feel, because of the way the culture makes them feel, how they work with other people, how working with those people makes them feel. They feel good about that team, good about the environment and the team dynamic. That's what makes them get up out of bed, not that they're squeezing out 120 extra basis points out of the P&L that quarter. It's good, but they don't care about that. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we had a great conversation today. We learned some really interesting points. We got great insights into your career, what shaped it, the different paths you took, the pivoting, how to get people to take chances on you, the type of things that, people look for, that you look for in a kind of an ambitious, young professional, how people can, a couple of life philosophies as well, right? Not only just looking at biopharma, but how you can go about some things in life.
Yeah.
yeah, work is not life, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. And I just wanted to thank you for coming on and giving some amazing insights. Ash, if you have any other final comments?
I mean, yeah, thank you so much for coming on today, giving us a new perspective. As I said before, on the biopharma industry and how your career is shaped through that industry, and some more life philosophy and some advice. So we really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So we'd love to have you on again, but for now, I think this is a good place to stop. So thank you so much.
Anytime. All right, take care.